listening to Poetics, where poetry meets the voice. I am Tamara Rockwood. I'm coming to you from Bainbridge Island, here in Clear, Washington State. This is episode 47, and today I am turning the microphone back over to Ben Rockwood. He's going to be talking to you about the press, about other things. I'm not going to spoil it because I've already listened to it and it's fascinating. It's what we talk about when the microphone's off, and I'm so glad that he's able to get on the podcast and tell you guys what we talk about when the microphone's off. So I'm sending this over to Ben, and I'll talk to you later.
Hello, poetry readers, poetry writers, and poetry lovers. Glad to be able to be back on the Poetics podcast to share some thoughts and ideas with you from the perspective of a reader and a designer. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the composition of books. Of course, in poetry, we generally have three forms that we think about in terms of like produced media. The most basic would be a broadside. That is generally a poster size print of a poem. Beautiful. Generally, this takes poetry to the place of art, something that gets framed and put in your house. The second would be the chapbook, which would be, comes from the British cheap book, back from the days of pulp. These are short books, right, that have sort of a wider latitude to them in terms of sort of what we can put in them. We do a digital series of those through Express. And then long form, which is going to be our typical poetry collections where we're talking 60 to 100, 120 pages fully rendered, which generally means somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 poems, usually. I want to focus on both chapbooks and long form and come at it from maybe a different perspective than you're used to. Tamara will give you the position of a writer and the position of an editor and from the position of acquisitions. She's a scholar. I, on the other hand, am a reader and a designer. I care a lot about how a book reads, and I like taking that perspective as a poetry lover and reader and then bringing that back to you as a writer so that you can maybe think about how you're going to construct your narrative arcs, your flow throughout a poetry collection. So I want to share a couple of things that I've sort of come to over the years and a structure that I've found that works for me when I was struggling to find ways that I could convey to others the way that I was looking at writing. I want to start with when you're looking at writing a collection, even a chapbook, but particularly with a collection, you're creating all the poetry that you write is coming together into one form. I know that seems obvious, but of all the poems that you've written, you've selected some variety of them to come together, and they're all going to live in close proximity to each other. So when we do that, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? And while it is possible and does happen that poetry books are put out that are simply just almost random collections of poems of just representing various works by the author, generally we want them to have a lot more of a cohesive and curated approach. One of the ways I like to think about this actually is the mixtape metaphor. I'm, proud Gen Xer, and those of you in the 80s will remember the cassette era. Back then, especially if you were younger, there was a lot of music out there, but you had to go buy it, right? And when you did have money to go buy music, you bought a tape. You had to make a careful choice about what you chose. So the way a lot of us actually got music was to actually record it off the radio. Or to sort of slowly build up a collection of tapes. And one of the ways that we would often show affection and familiarity to other people would be to create them a mixtape. We would, sit there for hours taking things off the radio, off other tapes, and put them into a collection. And it's very similar to sort of what we do when we're putting together a poetry book. when you do it, you first think very much about your goals, right? Who am I creating it for? What is my emotion towards that person? Is this my boyfriend, girlfriend? Is this my mother, father? Is this my friend? Right? What is the sort of emotion and approach that I'm going to take to producing this mixtape? And then we think about, okay, well, what are the songs that represent that I want to put on it, that represent me, and that I want to convey to the person who's receiving this mixtape. Then we think about sequencing. Okay, what order do I put into it? And I've sort of, within albums, you have this tendency to sort of start off with something that's kind of a hook and maybe a little lighter. Then your big hit tends to be like the second song. Then you pull it back a little bit for that third song, and you kind of move forward. And of course, with the tape, you have two sides, so you sort of having a beginning, a middle, and an end twice on both sides. And it becomes really sort of easy to think through because of the fact that I'm using somebody else's created art and I'm purely composing it and curating it into a collection that represents myself and my relationship to the other person. I think it's kind of like easy to wrap your head around how you can go about thinking about how this work comes out. One of the things that I would really emphasize to any writer is write for the reader. Now, writing for the reader can come in kind of two senses. One is it can convey what it is that you think that the person receiving this text is going to want to consume, right? That can be populist. It could be things that you think people will like. It can be a message that you're trying to convey, and you're gonna write pieces and arrange pieces in order to help convey that message that you're trying to send. But that can also come from the other side, and I think generally more powerful. And I think the truly great artists, the ones with a really unique perspective and voice, are the ones who actually write books that they themselves would want to read. You can see sort of a lot of like very interesting pieces of art essentially come out of anger of, I really like this aesthetic. I really like this kind of book, but I haven't found many, or I only found one or two. And I really think there should be more in the world because this is exactly the book I want to buy. And because nobody else is creating it, I'm going to go and create it. That I think is a really, really powerful place to come from. And taking it back to that mixtape metaphor, right? You might be creating that mixtape because you want to convey your, emotion to another person. Like if you're doing it for your boyfriend, girlfriend, right? You want to sort of show them, your love and the aspects of your personality and your relationship. But then it also might be somebody who says, yeah, I don't listen to a lot of jazz. And you come up with sort of a best of jazz collection, right? To share with them, what jazz really is. In all cases, when the reason I like that the mixtape metaphor is this: what's always central is you thinking of how you want the person receiving it to interpret and enjoy it. That's something that happens, I think, in that metaphor that doesn't necessarily happen to a lot of authors when they're writing a book. Very often, you can get sort of deep in the weeds of what you're trying to do that you sort of lose sight of the fact that this is ultimately going to be consumed as hopefully a whole, and that particularly in poetry books we have the problem of people flipping to the middle, so they may not consume it front to back in perfect linear order, which means you need to think about it in a multidimensional sort of way. Either way, whether you're making a mixtape or you're making a book or a chapbook, we should be able ultimately to step back and to see the sort of larger narrative flow and describe it as a single log line. If you can't describe the book in a single log line, then there's something wrong with the approach that you're taking. And that might be that it's not sufficiently constructed. It also may not be, it also may be that you're doing something that you haven't seen. And this is where it could be really good to take it to somebody else and be like, hey, I really like the way this is going, but if I had to describe it in one line, I don't know that I could. Could you consume it? Give me your thoughts. Maybe you see a pattern that I don't, right? Sometimes as a poet, you're just too close to the work. So that can be really helpful, right? You might get somebody else who sees that there is something going on, perhaps subliminal, that you're putting into the piece that you yourself don't see. When I think about literature, and I'm going to step back, and I'm going to talk a little bit about prose for a minute, and then we're gonna apply this back into poetry. But I started reading in earnest about 10 years ago. I was, in business and technology. I read voraciously since I was a kid. But for a long, long time, it was nonfiction. I was one of those silly people who actually prided myself on the fact that, I don't read that fiction stuff. I'm very serious. I read philosophy and I read business books and I read nonfiction, but I don't read that fiction stuff. And, I got to a place in my life where I realized that there's only so much you could sort of say in nonfiction. I know that sounds trite, but anyone who's read a lot of self-help books or a lot of business books, what you'll find is that typically the book has about 4 to 5 pages of ideas, and then the rest of the book is padded out to 200, 300, 350 pages, full of anecdotes and other ways of sort of conveying the message or looking at it in a different way, and it can kind of become a little frustrated that you've got these huge bookshelves full of all these nonfiction books, and honestly, you're like, they could be pamphlets. They don't need all that padding, and it can be a little frustrating, and certainly not as creative as one would like. So anyway, I got to this place in my life where I started thinking, maybe it was time, and the real catalyst to that was Tamara set down David Foster Wallace's Pale King in front of me and said, "This is kind of strange and you might like it." And I read the first 3 chapters and realized that there were things you could do in long form prose that I just had not imagined that it was possible. I just had never seen it. And so I decided that I clearly was wrong and needed to go and re-educate myself. I started off by reading everything that I lied about reading, all that stuff in high school where you read like the first chapter and the last chapter, or you skimmed it for a test, or, somebody said you should check out this book and you'd skim like, the first like quarter of it and then go like, yeah, I read it. No, I didn't. I kind of went through, made a list and fixed all that. And then I started reading classics, and then I just sort of dug into genres. And as I did, I started to find the things that suited me and didn't. One of the things that was great about coming to particularly classics as a person later in life is I wasn't reading it for any reason. I wasn't reading it for a test. I wasn't reading it to give a presentation or something. And so I was reading purely for the enjoyment of it. I was just taking it in because I wanted to take it in, not because I had to. And your approach when you do that is very different. So I was reading a lot of the classics purely as entertainment, which is very different than taking it, as part of a course or something like that, where you're just trying to glean things out of it rather than really just enjoy the ride, as it were. And as I went through, I'll spare you a bunch of the journey details, but I came up with a way of describing what I liked about a book by using what I call 3S, which is style, story, and structure. So style is going to be the voice, is what we would commonly call it, right? That's the sort of swagger. Russian literature, and for instance, I really adore because of the fact that it tends to be a first person or third person narrator who is unreliable, right? In a sense, the narrator is themselves a character in the work, albeit sort of a translucent one. The way in which they add or remove details, what they choose to include or not include. There's all kinds of very interesting sort of stylistic choices. Maybe one of the strongest stylistic voices in American literature, although I always feel weird saying American literature, but would be Nabokov, right? If you've read just the first couple of lines, a little less, first chapter of Lolita, you'll know exactly what good style and what strong voice really is. I ended up, when I read Lolita, I read it because I wanted to be able to defend my opinion that it was lewd trash that no one should read. And after the first page, I was immediately condemned that it was beautiful. It was incredibly beautiful. And so all of a sudden I realized that the grotesque and the beautiful that sort of clashed in a way that was really interesting and unique and artistic. That brings us to our second. So style first, then story. Story is what most people, when they describe a book, talk about is the plot, the characters, what happens in the book. I generally find that that's, to me anyway, generally the least interesting sort of thing. The story is, in my opinion, is the sort of scaffolding on which a story is a book, a work is created, but ultimately actually not the most important to me anyway. Which brings us to the third, which is structure. Structure is the way in which you sort of organize the book, where you start, where you stop, the degree of linearity, the way you use chapters and parts or sections. A lot of my favorite books, being Russian and then American postmodern literature, tend to have really unique and bizarre structures. In that, like, for instance, Infinite Jest is a book I love. This is probably one of the most outrageous sort of forms of structure, in that the beginning, the end is the first chapter, and the beginning of the book is about midway. The whole book is actually structured on a mathematical fractal in the shape of a triangle, although it was cut down quite a bit, so it ultimately didn't have a perfect sort of shape to it, but it was really audacious in its attempt. And then, of course, one of the primary elements of the book was tennis, and so there were all these things he wanted to add, but were sort of outside the narrative flow, and so he added extensive footnotes at the end of the book, which then created this interesting situation in which, as you were reading the book, if you read it properly with the footnotes, and if you didn't read the footnotes, you actually ended up missing out on actually the most important parts of the plot, and you actually didn't. If you didn't read the footnotes, you basically would never actually know what the story was about, or at least you wouldn't appreciate its depths. And so as you were reading it, you were flipping back and forth, front of the book, back of the book, front of the book, back of the book, like a tennis match, which was really clever. A simpler form of that could have been seen in Gravity's Rainbow. In Gravity's Rainbow, of course, that is a circular story. The beginning is the end, and the end is the beginning, and the two are connected together like a snake eating itself, such that you can ultimately read the story round and round and round, over and over and over, and it sort of never really ends. Those kinds of books are great, but they're also hard, right? In that you necessarily have to read them at least twice to fully appreciate it, because the first time you're on a roller coaster, you don't know where it's going, you don't know what's happening, you're just along for the ride. And if you don't like that kind of uncertainty, you'll throw the damn thing across the room. But some of us do like that, and we just sort of throw our hands in the air and go woo, and just like, I don't know what's happening, but it's lots of fun. And at the end, you sort of go, oh, and then you have to reread it again so that you can then notice all the signs, as you go along, because you didn't appreciate that, you didn't know what to focus on the first time around. Those are fun, but they're big and they're heavy. And I find with a really great author with a really great style and a really great structure, if the story can hold those two things up, I end up with books where I almost don't want it to end. I don't even want something to happen. Some people will find Russian literature frustrating because it seems like nothing happens, or it's really, really slow. But all that slowness is like in somebody's head, or multiple characters' heads, or sort of exploring the space, as it were. So even though the plot maybe not be moving forward, there's just layers and layers and layers of complexity and depth that are added onto the work that ultimately, to me, if it's done in a really fun and engaging voice, right, through the narration or the dialogue or whatever, if that style and structure is fascinating, I just don't ever want it to end. I remember Oblomov is a great example of a novel. I don't think many people have read it, but it was an incredible Russian novel. And very little happens throughout the whole book. And then actually when you get to the end, there's almost a sense of like, you got to like wrap it up. and then it ends, and it's kind of like unsatisfying because, it should have just kept going, which is kind of a metaphor for the plot, but I digress. So when we talk about style, story, and structure, I think it fits really well and sort of very apparently within long form prose fiction, literary fiction. But we can take those same basic ideas and bring it back to poetry, right? What is the style that you're going for in this work, or just what is yours as an artist? Maybe it changes from work to work. Maybe it's consistent throughout your work as defining you. You could broadly call this voice, but it's also the way in which you enunciate that voice on the page. Story, of course, is, what is it about, right? And then structure is how we're going to put that together. That's more distinctly that mixtape of which comes first, which comes in the middle, which comes in the end. How do we play with the ups and the downs of the work so that we get sort of a really beautiful flow? And particularly in poetry, I think it's really paramount to do that as forwardly as possible, to encourage the reader to not do that flip around the book, and instead give them a reason when they finish a poem to go like, oh man, I got to read the next one, right? Like that they just feel pulled in, and that you're not creating this sort of, shall we say, natural off-ramp at the end of every single poem, right? This is the problem you have in a book, right? At the end of a chapter, you normally want to create some type of hook that encourages the reader to flip the page to the next chapter and just keep reading, as opposed to go, okay, I'm done with chapter 9, I'm going to bed, right? You want them to feel this urgency and call to action to sort of move into the next piece, and that can be done in a variety of different ways, right? Hopefully that gives you some ideas. Each of you will interpret this slightly differently, which I think is awesome. And hopefully it gives you some ideas of how you might approach this with your own sense of style, story, and structure. I want to call out two interesting examples that I've seen in poetry. So the first is Janée Baugher's. I think I got her last name right. Yeah, Baugher. The Andrew Wyeth Chronicles. This was released, I think, by Tupelo Press. And what was interesting about this is, while it was essentially a book of ekphrastic poetry. I always hate saying that. It doesn't roll off the tongue, does it? Of Andrew Wyeth's poetry, it had a very interesting story style and structure. So the story was, of course, right, the elements of this that were those paintings that she was drawing observations from. The structure that she took was largely chronological. It was divided into parts. When I got to meet her, when I asked about the parts, I asked if there was a particular significance to the parts or if they were arbitrary, and it sounded like they were more or less sort of arbitrary to break things up. It wasn't like this is such and such period of his life and such period of his life. It was just sort of a way to bifurcate the work into a more sort of palatable, sequence. But then, the most important structural element was that each poem is actually simply footnotes, numbered footnotes. And those actually essentially come off as bullet points with sub-bullet points. Some of them have numbers, some of them have symbols. Some of them are very short, some of them are full sentences, some of those are simple little lines. But each one sort of takes on, there's a sort of a central sort of, approach in terms of the structure of each piece. Each one has its own elements that are specific to the work that she's describing. And the result is something bizarre and strange and foreign that almost doesn't, I think you could argue, is this even poetry? And it's delightful. I mean, it's just incredible. it really gets you thinking about, what is poetry? What does poetry need to look like? In some places, you can't really ignore the bullet point structure. In other cases, you can actually take them away and just read it like they were individual lines of a poem. To me, Wyeth, was a great painter. I enjoy his work, but the way that she structured this just is kind of a ride, right? It's full of excitement and interest in the way that she structured each piece. And it's just, I don't know, I think it's really refreshing. It's just, I'd never seen anything else like it. And it's fun. It's a lot of fun. I mean, I think she did something really remarkable with it. The other that I wanted to cite was Maggie Smith's memoir, You Can Make This Place Beautiful. In both cases, I got to meet the author. Maggie, I got to see at Powell's Books. Actually, I was in town for a conference and went over to my beloved Powell's. And it just so happened she was doing a book signing and talked that night. I got to ask some questions and get a book signed and talk to her a little bit. It was great. If you look through this memoir, if you haven't read it, I'd suggest that you get a copy of it and read it, or at least, go someplace and look at a preview of it. She's writing prose as though it was a poem. And I talked to her a little bit and tried to dig into this, and I don't even know if it seemed like she wasn't even fully aware of what she was doing. But I thought it was remarkable and actually has academic significance, because each part of her memoir here is essentially poem length. It's like 1 to 2 pages, and you can read it as either prose or poetry. So I'm just going to read a little bit here to illustrate my point. This is, I think, on page 148. Sleight of Hand is the name. Now, I can approach this as prose. One afternoon, I was listening to Derek Delgadio, a master of sleight of hand on NPR. He talked about secrets, their weight, their heft. He talked about how carrying them affects your breathing, your speech, your movements. You have to remember who knows what. You have to remember which versions of these stories you've told and to whom and when. If you tell the truth, there's nothing to, quote, keep straight, unquote, nothing at all. The truth isn't easy, but it's simple. Okay, that's the first half of it. Now, I mean, that just reads like prose. I mean, these are full sentences, right? There's no enjambment, right? Full lines, full justified, normal looking sort of prose. However, if you look at the way that she uses punctuation, commas, periods, em dashes, she's essentially writing free verse. And I think it's delightful because it's like she almost like can't help herself. Like she's doing it subconsciously. So if I come back and I reread this and I do this, treating it as poetry, right? And really focus on the punctuation as essentially where enjambment would occur. One afternoon, I was listening to Derek Delgado, a master of sleight of hand on NPR. He talked about secrets, their weight, their heft. He talked about carrying them. Sorry about that. He talked about how carrying them affects your breathing, your speech, your movements. You have to remember who knows what. You have to remember which versions of the stories you've told and to whom and when. If you tell the truth, there's nothing to keep straight, nothing to work at. The truth isn't easy, but it's simple. Okay, and it goes on. It's like it's all there. She wrote a prose poem. In fact, prose poetry is something I've always struggled to get my head wrapped around. And there was a Penguin book a while back that was released that was like a collection of prose poetry. And it was funny. I mean, the introduction was like, I'm an expert in prose poetry, and I really don't even know what it is. And it was a fascinating book. I won't go off into that because it's running long. But to me, if anything ever was prose poetry, this book by Maggie Smith is it. I mean, it's truly incredible to read. like, so you can approach it just as I want to know more about Maggie Smith and her life. She has a lot of details about her life that have been alluded to in her work in the past, but not maybe explicitly drawn out. And so you can just read this because I like Maggie Smith and I want to know about more of her life, and you can just read it as prose. But you can also come back and look at it deeper and see something about her as a creator and who she is and how she thinks deep in her mind, in her subconscious mind. And really get really excited about the way in which this was structured and how much of this she describes it as just being the way she knows to write. And I was a little, I don't want, frustrated is maybe the wrong word, but I just couldn't believe that she wasn't more maybe proud and forward about her doing something really incredible artistically. She was really focused when I heard her, she was really much more focused on what she was trying to say. And like I said, in that's when we come back to the 3 S's, right? She was a lot more interested in the story she was trying to tell and the audience she was trying to address with it. Whereas what came along for that ride, unintended, was an incredible piece that had style and structure that I think was deeply postmodern, or at least matches deeply with postmodern aesthetic. And what's all the more amazing is that it was unintended. It wasn't calculated necessarily to be quite that, or at least maybe not to the degree that I accept it. So I hope that, I actually think that I have my feelings about Maggie Smith's different works. This one, I think, if I was teaching a class on poetry, I would make this a required text, because I think it's so interesting to go beyond that story and look at style and structure and what it does to the story she's trying to tell, and tells you so much more about her and her mind. Anyway, fantastic stuff out there. And so the real takeaway here is think about, where you're trying to go when you're thinking about, who is my reader? Who am I focusing on? Who am I trying to talk to? What am I trying to convey in terms of emotion and message, right? And then hopefully you can think about them in terms of style, story, and structure, as to what choices are available to you and how you want to bring that across, and then ultimately create, to some degree, that sort of perfect mixtape, right? Where when you hand it off, you have that incredible sense of pride of, this is for you, my friend. You're going to love this. I hope you enjoy this. I enjoyed making it, and I hope you enjoy consuming it, because this is an artifact of our relationship. That's what we can do. And so I hope this encourages you and gives you some different ways to think about things. I look forward to joining you again in the future. I'll probably talk more about, layout and design and things like that. But this is an important one that's near and dear to my heart as a reader. So thank you very much. I'll see you next time.
All right. That is all for today, poetry friends. If you've enjoyed diving into the world of verse and books with us, please join us next time, where we've got more poets to meet, more poems to explore, and more literary adventures to share. So until then, keep reading, keep writing, and keep poetry close to your heart. Thank you for joining Poetics Podcast, where we bring poetry to life, one verse at a time.